So I'll start with how to draw the thalamus, and then I'll get into a little bit of the functions. You only have to be able to draw 3 symbols to do it. The Y, the line, and the cross. So you have a sideways letter Y, just a simple vertical line, and a plus sign. And I'll show how to do it now. You draw your circle, obviously. That's your thalamus. So these 3 lines are what allow you to divide the thalamus into its parts. So first you draw the Y, then the then the line, then the plus, and that's it. With some qualifications. So this letter Y, don't draw it in the middle like that. Don't draw it even though that's the natural thing to do. You want to draw it more close to the top. With this line, you want to draw it near the back, not in the middle. Because when you draw that line, you're dividing off the pulvinar, which is the biggest chunk of the thalamus that's all the way in the back. So respect the pulvinar, give him his space. You draw that line here to divide him off. And you do that before adding the plus. Okay, and that plus is the last part. So now I'll do it with labels. When you add the Y, what are you doing? You just got your anterior nucleus and your dorsal medial nucleus. Okay, which are these are the only 2 parts of the thalamus that have to do with cognitive things. Everything else in the thalamus is just more simple motor sensory stuff. So these ones have to do with the mind, while all the rest is the body. You could put it that way. The second step is that line. You just separate it off the pulvinar, which does vision. So my mnemonic for that is eyes in the back of your head. You know, mothers have eyes in the back of their heads, right? And that's how it works in your brain anyway. Your occipital lobe, which does vision, is all the way in the back of the brain. So your thalamus is set up the same way. The visual part is all the way in the back. So that was the second step, the line, right? And then the third step is going to be that plus. And that's where you get your your LA, right? Lateral anterior, your LP, lateral posterior, and your VA, ventral anterior, and your VP, ventral posterior, right? So they follow that anterior-posterior relationship. All the anterior stuff is obviously in the front, anterior, and all the posterior stuff is in the back, posterior, except for there were some cheats. This is not actually called the lateral anterior, even though it should be. It's called the lateral dorsal for whatever reason, but I just like to think of it as the lateral anterior to make it easier to remember, and so it makes more sense for me. So how do I avoid getting confused between the lateral dorsal and the lateral posterior? How do I make sure I know that the lateral dorsal is not here, right? Well, the way I look at it is the thalamus is basically 4 parts. That's what our plus is for. If we divide it horizontally, we get the ventral part, which is these 2 guys, and you could say the lateral part, which is all this stuff at the top, right? These are not official terms, parts. These are how I look at it. The ventral part, this bottom part, is very simple. It's just anterior versus posterior, right? The ventral anterior nucleus versus the ventral posterior nucleus. This top half is a little more complicated because it's 4 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4. But really it's not, because it's really only 2 parts, because these guys are the same thing and these guys are the same thing, right? They're connected and they have the same function, right? Same for these guys here. So the way I avoid getting them confused is when I look at this top part, the name of the position, meaning either the word anterior or the word posterior, has to be somewhere in the name here, in one of these nuclei. So if we look at the anterior 2 nuclei, anterior nucleus, right? It's in the name. If we look here at the 2 posterior ones, which are the LP and the pulvinar, lateral posterior, it's in the name, right? It's not in the name here. It's only in the name of 1 nucleus on each side. So if this was the lateral dorsal, then the word posterior would not be present anywhere in any of the nuclei here in the back. So that's how I know this one is the lateral dorsal. There's another cheat code, which is that you don't actually have 1 ventral posterior nucleus. You have your ventral posterior lateral and your ventral posterior medial, right? So you have your VPL and your VPM, both located in this same area, except of course the VPL is more lateral while the VPM is more medial, so it's deeper into the page. So that's another cheat. But the reason I do it in that cheating way is because it makes it easier to remember. Then the reticular is like this little side character that just lines the outside of the whole thing, of the whole thalamus. It's just like a little add-on on the side. And then the same for these guys. The MGN, medial geniculate nucleus, and the lateral geniculate nucleus, which you have already learned about before. So these geniculate nuclei and the reticular nucleus are add-ons. You have a more complete diagram if you add them. But honestly, when I draw it for my own purpose, I don't really draw them because they're kind of doing their own thing. When I'm thinking about the thalamus and the parts that all relate to each other, it's pretty much just these, right? You draw your thalamus, you got your Y, your line, and your plus. 1, 2, 3. And then the names make sense according to the positions, with a little bit of cheating here and a little bit of cheating here. So that's it. So just to talk a little bit about function, our framework is anterior versus posterior equals motor versus sensory, right? The shape determines function. The location gives us clues as to the function of that particular nucleus. So just really quick, our anterior nucleus does memory because it connects to the hippocampus. Our dorsal medial nucleus does learning, which is kind of like cognition and emotion combined, two opposite components put together. So it's special, it's up here. This guy's special, it's cognitive. Other than that, it's just motor versus sensory, right? So the pulvinar is all the way in the back, so it does a type of sensory, right? What type of sensory does it do? Vision, right? The ventral anterior, it does motor coordination because it connects to the basal ganglia, right? It's motor, it's in the front. The ventral posterior, it's posterior, so it's sensory. It does somatosensation. The VPL, somatosensation for the body. The VPM is somatosensation to the face. Somatosensation meaning the sense of touch. The LGN and MGN, they're in the back, so they're sensory. And that just does arousal, so it's not part of this framework.